So much everyone for coming today. We're truly honored that Hongbin and Yingyi Qian, two outstanding scholars from China's two very best universities, have traveled from about 6,000 miles away to help us make sense of what's currently happening in China's economy and the prospects ahead. Here at CEPR and elsewhere at Stanford, we're very focused on building academic ties with scholars at Peking University and Tsinghua. Hosting Hongbin and Yingyi as professors and deans of the business schools at both institutions definitely strengthens these bonds. It makes it all the more special that both Hongbin and Yingyi have a connection to Stanford, and more on that in a few minutes. But first, I would just like to spend a couple of minutes to give you some details about our upcoming events. We have an action-packed calendar over the next few weeks as we approach the conclusion of the academic year here at Stanford. So next Friday, on May 20th, we'll be holding our next policy forum, which will telescope in on healthcare policy in the US. And the main question that we'll be asking at this policy forum is whether, 6 years after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the healthcare system in the US is any healthier. We'll hear from CEPR faculty and from leaders in business policy and from think tanks too. The next week, on Thursday, May 26th, we'll have an associates event with one of our senior fellows, David Brady, who's also a professor in our Graduate School of Business and in our Political Science Department. And he will talk about the state of our political parties in light of the recent Trump and Sanders campaigns and everything else. So I think that will be of great interest to many of us. And then the following week, on Thursday, June 2nd and Friday, June 3rd, our Stanford Center for International Development, which is a part of CEPR, will host the 17th Annual Conference on Indian Economic Policy Reform. We're going to host leading policymakers from India, including the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Raghu Rajan, along with many scholars from Stanford and elsewhere. And this sort of just scratches the surface of all the things that are going on at CEPR currently. So now let me turn to introduce our two very distinguished speakers. First, Hongbin Cai is a professor of economics and the dean of the Guanghu School of Management at Peking University. He actually earned his PhD here at Stanford in economics in 1997, and he has received many, many awards over the years since. For example, he received an award from the National Science Foundation of China as a National Outstanding Young Researcher, and he is a fellow of the Econometric Society and the founding director of the Chinese Finance Association. His groundbreaking research focuses on game theory, the Chinese economy, industrial organization, and corporate finance, and he has published many academic papers in top international journals. One that particularly caught my attention as I was putting together my remarks was the paper Eat, Drink, Firms and Government, an investigation of corruption from entertainment and travel costs of Chinese firms. So I hope that we'll get a chance to talk a bit about his insights from that paper about the author's results. Their introduction concludes by saying their study has important implications for how optimally to curb corruption. So we'll hear about that. Yingyi Qian is the professor at the School of Economics and Management at Tsinghua University, and he has been the dean there since September of 2006. He was born in Beijing and graduated from Tsinghua in 1981 and received his PhD in economics from Harvard after getting a master's in management science and operations research from Yale and a master's from Columbia, so a lot of East Coast institutions. He is currently the editor-in-chief of 3 academic journals, and he has also received many, many honors over the years, including appointment as a fellow of the Econometric Society and a recipient of the 2009 Sun Yifang Prize in Economic Sciences. His main research includes areas such as comparative economics, institutional economics, the economics of transition, and the Chinese economy. And he has published in many international journals on topics including the return to capital in China and who are China's entrepreneurs. I really think we're in for an incredible treat to hear from two such knowledgeable and distinguished speakers. Each will give 5 or 10 minutes of remarks, and then we're going to pivot to some Q&A. And there was some discussion about which of the two should go first, and we batted this around and talked about it a bit, but I found Hongbin's point that Yingyi was one of his thesis advisors as a compelling reason for Yingyi to go first. So please join me because Yingyi was previously on the faculty here at Stanford, in addition to at UC Berkeley, Maryland, before making the move to Tsinghua. So please join me in welcoming them both to CEPR, and let's start with Yingyi.
I feel extremely delighted to be back to Stanford. I was on the faculty here for 9 years in the 1990s. Actually, John Chauvin interviewed me at the job market at the time. So had a wonderful time in those days, and many of my papers written in the other building next to this one. I want to make some brief remarks on the very question that many people in this room and around the world interested in or concerned about, is the slowdown of China's growth. First, I want to bring two pieces of information. Number one is that IMF recently revised growth forecast for the entire world and for China. For the entire world, they revised downward the growth rate for this year. But for China, they revised upward. So that's one piece of information. Second is on today's People's Daily front page. There's a very important article. It's an interview with the very authoritative person. Okay, that's the original word, which means they must be from very, very high up of the government. There are many messages there, but the very important one that concerns our topic today is China's growth rate will not be U-shaped, will not be V-shaped, nor U-shaped. Instead, will be L-shaped. Okay, this is on today's first page, China People's Daily. Okay. Well, L-shaped, we don't know which part of that we're now, right? But we're pretty sure that will be for a long time on this flat part. I think that carries a lot of information in it. Now, how to make sense of that? I think we need to put this in perspective. I was here in the mid-1990s. I think the China's growth rate slowdown is very easy to understand from economic perspective. Very simple variable can explain. That is the level of development of per capita income. Here are three numbers. In 1995, 20 years ago, per capita income in China was $800 US. In 2005, 10 years ago, was 1,800. Last year, 2015, was 8,000. That tells a lot. It tells us the fast growth in the last 20 years or 30 years was the simple story of catching up. From very low, a few $100s per capita basis, to all the way to 8,000, which is the solid middle income country. So therefore, economic laws principle will tell us it has to slow down. It's inevitable, it is normal. So that's the point I want to make. That is, this slowdown, this L shape, that support that argument is a universal law in economics. Number two, the remark I want to make is why we concern so much about this, because all the countries went through this period. Think about the countries around the world, they developed, Korea, Taiwan, Japan. They always went through this period that from a few $100s to $8,000 to $15,000 to $30,000. All of them experienced slowdown. But why we concern so much about China? here is another set of numbers I think will explain. That is, size matters. Okay, very simple. Now, again, I give you a few numbers, very simple. In 1995, the total GDP of China was $800 billion. The US, $8 trillion. So roughly, China's size was 10% of the US. 10 years later, 2005, or 20 years ago, China's total GDP was $2.3 trillion. I'm using the current exchange rate, okay? There's no PPP here. So $2.3 trillion. The US, $12 trillion. So China's about 20% of the US. So 10 years ago was only 20%, less than 20, 19%, close to 20% of the US. Last year, the 2015, China's GDP was $10 trillion. The US, $17 trillion. So almost 60% of the US. So you see that over the 20 years, moving from 10% of the US to 20% of the US to 60% of the US. That change shows that China is important. You know, even though China went through the similar process of many other countries, but the sheer size would make a huge difference. So that's why now today, so many people now pay attention to everything happening in China because size matters. Now, actually it matters more than what the number I gave you. If you look at the incremental growth, now, China's $10 trillion economy accounts for 13% of the world total. But in terms of growth, it counts for 30% of growth. So at the margin, China matters even more. So put all this together, I think the message I want to add in the remarks, at the very beginning, I want to say that this slowdown is very normal, inevitable, and I do believe this L-shaped pattern of growth will be the likely prospect for the next 10 years or 20 years. We will not expect a V or U-shaped. So I think that's perfectly consistent with the analysis I just gave. Second is that given that the size of China is so big, we are experiencing the impact of the global economy is unseen in the past. For the past 20 or 50 or 30 or 50 years, we saw the rise of the Japanese economy or Korean economy and many other economies. But in comparison, these are so-called small economies. Japanese economy is big, but however, in comparison to China's, it becomes small. So therefore, we are experiencing something that on the one hand is very normal, it's fit to economic models very well. On the other hand, the impact of what's going on in China or for the rest of the economy, the global economy, will be unprecedented. So these are the two comments I want to make about how to think about the slowdown of the China's growth rate and what we should expect for the future. So I want to stop here for these brief comments.
Great, wonderful. Hongbin?
All right, so let me start by saying that I'm extremely honored to be here. And then Stanford is like an intellectual home for me, so this is a very nice homecoming. It's great to see my professors, Michael, John, Jeff, and then all the people, and then my lots of friends here. I think I'm here just to agree with everything Yingyi just said, and then I defer all the difficult questions to Yingyi. He handles all the tough questions very well. Here's the reason I got into Stanford. Yingyi was in the admission committee, and then I was the last one he picked up from like pool of 100 Chinese people. So I got very lucky with feel very grateful to Yingyi. But let me just say that I will try to disagree with Yingyi as much as I can, just for the sake of debate. He talked about the slowing down and the growth number and all these other things. For that, because he basically stated the official lines, I don't want to disagree. What I want to disagree is try to disagree on is the basis of the statement, the numbers, especially Chinese GDP number. Right, we are growing according to the official statistics. Last year we grew at 6.9, and the first quarter we grow at 6.7. But if you go to China, almost everyone will tell you that we feel like we're in a recession. I think in the micro courses, Michael and then John Taylor and other people, when they had a class, they never said it's possible to have a recession with growth rate of 6.9. And this is only possible in China because everything goes in China. So, and that's how people feel, right? Growth rate at 6.9, a recession with a growth rate of 6.9. No, what's wrong? I think then what's wrong is that, you mentioned this L shape. It certainly depends on where the other leg, right, goes, right? If at 6.5, that's not bad. But the basis for the GDP statistic will be the key, right? How do we understand this? I think everyone agree, both international observers and domestically, this number cannot be taken as the GDP number or as the GDP growth number in other countries. This has lots more meaning than the usual GDP number. It's lots of political meanings in this, and it's produced in a different process. So Chinese leaders are rumored to say that they don't trust the GDP number. Tell us some more objective indices. So if the number is not the typical GDP number, everyone is familiar with, then how do we make sense of the growth and the slowing down, and then when it's good, when it's a bad time? And also, more importantly, for the last 38 years, according to the official statistics, Chinese economy grew at roughly 10%. If the number is all made up, right, whether the economic achievement is just a statistic fake, I think that's the basic question to understand the Chinese economy. And here, the perspective I want to offer is the following. The number, first you have to understand how the number is made up in the process. I was in the member of the National People's Congress. So 2 years ago, I submitted a formal proposal. And the proposal suggested that the Chinese government should change the way it sets annual growth target. Because currently, this is done through the following process. The end of the current year, the central government somehow set a national growth target for the next year, and suppose it's 8%. And this will be announced to the country. And then every province will set their targets, and then every city will go on doing their targets. And as lots of people's work has shown, especially Yingyi's work on this federalism, decentralization, Chinese local the governments basically have a growth tournament. So once the national government sets a national annual growth rate of 8%, every province will set 9 or above. And every city will set 10% or above. And every county will be 11% above. So it's really top down. Now, what's going to happen, because this is really the national growth target. Now, what happens by the end of the year? Sometimes you have a good year. Sometimes you don't have a very good years, bad years, like affected by the US and the world economy, right? It's so easy to blame on all the others. Now, suppose you have a bad year. And then suppose you're mayor in your city. You announced the target early on is 12%, 11%, let's say. And this is a bad year. You only grow like 6%. What do you report? You don't want to say I have a terrible year, I just did 6. So every other mayor will say they have 10%. So what you do is, if you can, right, you report like 9.5 or 10 or 10.5, right? Depending on your guess how well everyone else is doing. So that's your strategy in a bad year. Now, what if this is a really good year and you actually grew 14%? Your best strategy is not to report you did 14%, right? Because that will sound, everything's so easy, right? So you will say, I tried everything. I tried so hard, and I set the target to 11%. Now I managed to do 12%. So in the good years, they underreport. And in the bad years, they overreport. So over the years, they probably offset. And there are other offsetting manipulations. Private sectors tend to underreport because where's the tax if you grow so much, right? And then the public sectors, because they're under this growth tournament, they tend to overreport. The regional, the coast regions tend to underreport. The inland region tend to overreport. So you're putting all these distortions together. This is quite a complicated process. Now, as the growth rate is determined top-down, so you actually don't need to predict, because this is going to be follow the national growth rate pretty closely. But what it does is that, in the good years, they will be slightly over the growth target. In the bad years, they'll be slightly under. So the direction usually will be right, but the absolute level will be pretty off. But over the years, it kind of offset each other. So when people ask the question, given the process, so come back to my proposal. So my proposal is that we should change the way they set the growth target. We should do it in a bottom-up approach, right? Let every country do it, set their growth targets, every city, every provinces, then you add it up. That's such a natural thing, right? Shanghai can say, I'm just growing 4% next year, and then some provinces in the West can say, I want to grow 10%. But my proposal seems to be so simple and so natural, rightfully dismissed by the government so far. So this is how things stand. We're still using the same top-down approach. And then it quite comes to the question, given that there are so many manipulations, how do we think about the total size? Yingyi cited many numbers where China's total size growth contributions. This is all based on official statistics. Can we believe that? So my guess is that magically, despite all the manipulations, distortions, I think overall, the total size of the Chinese economy, even though no one knows the real number, I think roughly in the ballpark. Here's why I think so. I think in 2015, China exported about 2.4 trillion US dollars to the rest of the world. And total GDP is roughly 10 trillion US dollars. So in other words, China exported roughly 24-25% of GDP to the rest of the world. And then you can take the processing trade, roughly counts less than 50%. You take all the processing trade off, China exports about 14% of GDP to the rest of the world. Do you know what's the ratio of export over GDP for Japan? 13%. So, right, the US is even smaller, but Japan is 13%. So I can't believe Chinese is that good at exporting. We're exporting proportionally more GDP to the rest of the world than Japan. So that means the denominator cannot be a lot smaller. So that's why I think the size of the Chinese GDP probably is roughly correct, given so many years of offsetting up and over report and under report. So that means I'm here to support what Yingyi just said. So that's my theory about the Chinese GDP number. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think roughly you are quite right that there are smoothing effect during the cycles, that's for sure. But I think over the long run, the number is roughly right.
If we're on this L too long, then the number will be totally off. We have to be up and down, then we're okay, right?
That was great. Thanks to both of you for those remarks. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. And my predecessor is going to get the first question. So John Chauvin. So you just be thinking hard, John. Good question. And Michael, you should be number 2 if you're game too. So Michael was right. He was your.
I worked for Michael.
For him
yeah,
for 4
he
years.
supported me for 4 years.
Yeah. So
and
he
then
gets the right then to ask you a question.
Certainly. And the reason I'm interested in number is that Michael had this great project on U.S. consumption saving models, if you remember well. And I crunched the number for the U.S.
Take Mike's work that you need to adjust quality. The China's GDP numbers should be revised upward rather than downward because
depend on which
quality.
Depend on which year.
The secular.
So there are plenty of areas where there's so many areas that I could ask about, but it's hard to resist given this this paper where you claim to have implications for how effectively to curb corruption. Sort of for you, let me ask you, Hongbin, first, and then Yingyi, you can weigh in and tell us a bit about the anti-corruption efforts, the success they're having, what are the opportunities on the horizon, and are they enhancing or slowing economic growth?
So I think the anti-corruption campaign since 2013 is one of the most important factors in for Chinese economy and for Chinese political system. Let me begin with the beginning statement by saying that I'm all for anti-corruption campaign because Yingyi had such a good life. I think that's totally wrong. So
as if you don't have.
Flew business class, and enjoying all the perks in life, and that's totally against the socialist value. So, so I'm all for it. But seriously, and this is one of the person who's very active in China's anti-corruption campaign. All bigger cases were reported first, not by the government, by Su Li's journal. She's the leading journalist in China and the investigative leaders. And she's had a long connection with Stanford. She came over here in 93 at Stanford as the Knight Fellow, 94. And from all the ideas she borrowed from Stanford, she went back to set up this is more or less independent media in China, and it became important force in China over the last 20 years. And especially important for the last 3 years, because all the major corruption cases were reported in your journal, right? In your media, is that right? So no one wants to be on her journal, that's for sure. Right. So, but anyway, the overall the anti-corruption campaign, I think, is necessary for China. The narrowly define the anti-corruption campaign, because as the research, some of the research I did and many other people did, corruption is sort of such important phenomenon economically and politically in China for the last 20, 30 years. And you go anywhere. I actually did another one on the China's land markets. And there as well, you can see that, at least according to our research, despite all the government's efforts, corruption took very subtle format and very hard to wipe out in the very important markets like China's land market. So, so everyone knows that corruption is such an important issue. I think it's true for all the developing countries, but especially true for China. So, but at least I'm very surprised. Before Su Li published all the corruptive cases, that corruption was so serious in some key parts of the Chinese society, army, and some of the high-level government officials. So you just from sort of common sense, I think no country can sustain that level of corruption in the long run. So in that sense, I think the anti-corruption campaign since 2013 was very necessary for the Chinese society. Now, the reason all the economists are interested in this is what's the relationship between anti-corruption and economic growth. Within China, outside China, people link these two things together. I think when people link these two things together, they actually changed the definition for anti-corruption campaign. What's going on in the last 3 or 4 years is that there's anti-corruption campaign, but there's also a more general sort of a disciplinary movement and sets tighter regulation and control in terms of regulated behavior of civil servants, SOE managers, university presidents and deans, and then all these people are now treated as a civil servants. And this is sometimes be generally called anti-corruption, but this is really just behavior codes for very large group of people in Chinese society. And that, I think, indeed has something to do with the economic growth. Because in a way, my understanding is that, with lots of these new policies and new regulations, on the one thing, it puts lots of restrictions on what you can do, but more importantly, it somehow change the incentive system for government officials, SOE managers, and university presidents and deans, in the sense that, in the old system, if you, all these people have pretty clear expectation and then have a pretty clear idea about what's to be expected of them. When we mentioned the growth tournament, for example, people knew that if the growth GDP growth rate in my region is ranked at the top, if the fiscal revenue goes up at the fastest among all my peers, then I'm going to be awarded. So people have a very well set incentive system. But with this new sort of disciplinary movement, some of that well familiar incentive system was taken out. And then the new incentive system is not there yet. So people know what now to do. So Yingyi knows that he can't go to bars every night, but he doesn't really know what to be expected of him as a dean in order to develop the school. So that, I think, that part of the effects on the incentive system has something to do with what's going on in the economy. I guess that goes back to the question.
Great. Yingyi, would you
I
like
just want to add a little bit there. I think the anti-corruption campaign is the most visible actions taken by the government in the last 3 years. That's obvious, had very widespread, profound impact on every aspect, not just the economy, but social life and the way we do business, or even the way we run business school or universities. Okay, very, very profound impact. Now, I just want to add to what Hongbin just said is that from economic point of view, now we economists, we think corruption is bad because it increased the transaction costs and it's bad for growth because you involve a lot of transfers, not transparent, and etc. However, there is an economic argument for that type of transaction, what we call the corruption, is that when you have an over-regulated economy, so you can grease the wheel. Okay, that's a typical second best type of argument. Say you have a lot of regulations, then you can have a little bit transfer of money so you can get things done quickly, get approval. So that's the economic argument behind what we use the term second best. It's not the first best. So with anti-corruption, I think that type of activities decreased dramatically. So I talked to the business people, particularly the younger generation. They say, oh, that's great. I don't need to give gifts or give bribe the government officials. Clearly, there is a decrease of that type of activities and the time spent on this rent-seeking behavior. So that's predictable by economic theory, and also we observe. On the other hand, this is why we try to argue that rule of law is very important. You need to reduce the government regulation at the same time establish the rule of law in order for everybody to do business easier than before. But that part has not been established. I think her journal, I think this is the most important journalist in China that to expose Madame Hu. She's trying to do two things. One is to expose corruption cases. That made her journal really, really important. On the other hand, she also at the same time calling for to build new institutions of rule of law. And for the reason exactly I just said, because otherwise, if the government still has a lot of regulations, now they don't receive these bribes and they do nothing, then still the business find it very difficult to start. So that's another part of this side effects of anti-corruption campaign is that business slowing down. You get slow approval from the government of the projects to do, in addition to people try to avoid risks, okay? That's on top of that. So therefore, we'll see in this transition period, before the better institutions or rule of law established, and then with this anti-corruption campaign, inevitably we should observe the slowing down of many businesses. So that's just add to what Hongbin just said.
That's great. There's so many things I want to ask about, but I'm just only going to ask one more question, and then then John, and we'll open it up. So many people. So here you are in Silicon Valley. A lot of people talk about Silicon Valley as being this amazing place for innovation, and so many companies come out of here. And one of the more successful recent companies is Uber.
Yes.
And Uber has been making some pretty significant efforts in China. Their CEO was quoted recently, though, as saying they're working hard there, but they're losing about $1 billion annually, perhaps somewhat higher than that. And so I'm curious if you can give us some insights. They're facing fierce competition there from DiDi and others, and whether this is reflective of this market specifically, your insights on it, what's happening there, and sort of the nature of competition in China right now for technology-based companies.
Yeah, Uber is a very interesting case. It's very specific, it's close to home. And by the way, I Ubered from airport to hotel, from hotel to here. I rely on Uber here. But there is only one company called Uber here. There are 5 companies in Beijing. Now, here is the interesting part. Uber is one of them. There's DiDi, you mentioned, but there are 2 or 3 others. Actually, the one I use most often is neither of these 2. It's called Shenzhou. Okay, that's another company. By the way,
you must have a share in there, right?
No. I have 0 shares in all of those things. Well, the interesting thing is that they are running the similar business model. That is, the Uber CEO, I met him in March in Beijing. He was at the forum there, so I met him. And by the way, the business model is similar, but with minor differences. Similar model is that they all try to grab market share. So they are losing money, 1 billion. Actually, it should be saying that they are burning money. That's for all these startup companies, they want to have a network effects. All of those 5, at least 5 rate, it's called ride-sharing companies. They're all, and it's very, very competitive. They're slightly different. For example, Uber, we know that they use credit card and etc. But DiDi is not. They're using existing taxis, and they expand from that. And then the company I use a lot is a very different model because it's the company owns the cars, and the drivers are employees. Why that have they target the upper end market? Because they feel, people like me, they feel that riding these taxis, you feel safer. You can leave stuff in it. They serve different markets. Now, the point I want to make is, by the way, last August, I also took our students to Uber headquarters in San Francisco. And it turns out there were 6 people talk to us. Well, I know we were coming from Tsinghua University. All the 6 were Tsinghua graduates, engineers. There are 10,000 Tsinghua engineers in the Silicon Valley. So, Anyway, so when we were told is that Uber could not get into Japan, could not get into Korea. And very difficult in Europe, in some cities, in Berlin, in Paris. But relatively speaking, it's tough in China, but in different ways. The government, relatively speaking, very friendly, but market competition is most intense in China because you have not one, two, you have 4 or 5 companies. By the way, the top 3 or 5 cities in terms of number of rides in Uber are all in China right now. So the top, because San Francisco, of course, you have a lot of Uber cars, but the population, the size is too small. Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangdong, huge. Beijing, 20 million in population. Even you have 5 companies, you still have. So another interesting development is that I didn't invest, but many other people invest in all these companies, including government sovereign wealth funds. They invest in Didi, they invest, I don't know, Uber, all these companies, they just invest in all these companies. So it's very, very lively. It's a marketplace that very interesting. We still don't know. My best bet is that I think quite a few, not all of them, I think at least 3 or 4 will survive because the market is big enough there. And the taxi drivers are not so organized like in Europe or New York City. So taxi drivers are not so organized, and the market is so big, and the demand is so big. So I think that they will probably will some consolidation, but in the end, I think several of them will survive. We'll see that not just one Uber, but several Uber-like companies in Beijing,
Great.
other parts of China.
Hongbin?
Yeah, I really have nothing to add because I feel like I'm a dinosaur in the Stone Age in this modern world. I don't use Uber, I don't use WeChat, and that's probably why I'm so confident about China's future. Too much information corrupts your mind. So he's very modern. Yingyi is on the frontier of every technology, first user of all the modern technology. So he's the most qualified expert.
Well, actually, my time spent at Stanford actually was part of that. I still remember yesterday I met Paul Milgram, my colleague at the economics department. I still remember in 1993, before Netscape, it showed me this hypertext and then how you can use that to browse the news. This is before Netscape. So really the time I spent at Stanford and Silicon Valley made me really very curious, interested in this technology stuff.
Wow.
Good for you.
That's great.
Make you young. Very young.
He was your advisor?
What's that?
Professor, but he was your professor, right?
He was.
Your professor.
Yeah, he's.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Certainly,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So John, why don't you start us off?
Well, I was just going to ask. You went through the history of China's movement from quite a poor per capita country to a solid middle-income country, and I was just going to ask. And now we're with this L shape, maybe in for slower growth. But I was wondering, is China now rich enough to really devote the resources to improve the environment? Because during the high growth, the environment got, as you know, very much deteriorated in terms of both air and water quality.
Yes, I think so. I think China is the middle-income country now. People value clean air much higher than before. That's clear that the residents of Beijing complain a lot about the pollution, about the foggy weathers, etc. Ironically, 5 years ago, it was the U.S. Embassy in Beijing brought up the issue of PM 2.5, the measure of this. And it's the residents, they complain. By the way, Hongbin, he has a lot of studies on that. He's visiting here. So I do think that it's related to the very high growth. There are some quasi-experiments here. There are occasionally international events in Beijing. For example, last year there was a big parade and there were some events. So they closed down all the coal burning facilities nearby. Then you have blue sky. So you can calculate the cost or the price of clean air. So of course, this is a temporary solution, not a long-term solution. They are going to close down this together with to solve the problem of overcapacity, coal and steel, all this surrounding Beijing. 100 million tons of steel production surrounding Beijing. Not in Beijing, but the province when Beijing is situated. So they are going to close down many of those things. And so that will, with a slower growth rate, that will have a better air quality, better environment. So when we see the the slowdown of the growth rate, actually the Chinese resident will benefit from a better quality of air and other water, etc. So it is actually, I found it very interesting now. The people outside China cares a lot more about the growth rate of China because, of course, the Chinese have to bear all the costs of this very high growth. By the way, I want to add one point. On paper, China's environmental protection has the highest standard in the world. I say this because once the former president of Tsinghua University is now the Minister of Environmental Protection. I know him quite well, so we discussed. It's true. They set standards too high. That's the problem. So the problem is implementation and execution. So it's not, they can give you examples of water, air, they have the standards very high, but the problem is too high. When you have too high standard, it's difficult to implement, and also it's economically does not make sense because all this have costs. So you should have a reasonable level of standards. So that's one thing that not many people know. Actually, it is true. They set standard too high. So that's another.
Let me see if Michael has a question for his former research assistant, and then we'll open it up.
Well, first of all, it's great to have both of you back at Stanford. I'm going to address this to both Yingyi and Hongbin. So we talked about GDP as the overall measure of the economy and issues about measurement, but certainly China's done extremely well and it's moved up substantially. But part of the economic change in the 12th and 13th plans was to rebalance the economy to domestic consumption away from exports and investment, partly because of what you just said, that there's massive overinvestment, overcapacity in basic industries like steel and cement and so on. And China has, relative to any other developing or middle-income country, an extremely low share, consumption share in GDP. And so the question becomes, how do you get ordinary citizens benefiting from the growth, get consumption up, rebalance in this way to take some pressure off of the trade sector? And so I'm wondering if you guys have any comments on that or any suggestions.
Hongbin, why don't you start?
Yeah, and now, thank you very much for asking the question. Now I really want to not be a Chinese, be a American student, because I want to say something that disagree with your statement. In Chinese, if my professor said something, the first thing I said would be yes, Yingyi, yes, Michael. But this time I want to say that the rebalancing is actually, in my own view, I think it's the wrong idea to look at the Chinese economy. The simple fact is that if you look at China's GDP, we just mentioned that the overall size and the growth rate. If you look at the structure, I think the consumption ratio proportion is seriously underestimated. And the investment ratio is seriously overestimated. If you balance out the two, the Chinese economy, in my view, is not that unbalanced. So the need to rebalance it is basically mistaken. Now, given the time, I don't want to get into the details, but just the one fact. In the US, household consumption is 70% of GDP. And 20% of the household consumption is on housing. So it's roughly 14% of GDP spent on housing consumption. In China, only a few years back, the same number, housing consumption as percentage of GDP. Take a wild guess for anyone who's been into China. Someone take a guess? 35, 20%, and the young people will say, oh, it's 45%. The official statistics, 3%. 3%. Right.
To imputed rents. So that's
3% of housing consumption in China is GDP. Everyone who's been to China, the young people is laughing because they feel the pressure. Chinese people are just obsessed with housing. Obsessed. The household income, household wealth is all on the housing. And your success is measured by whether you own a house in Beijing or Shanghai. Personal success, right? I think Yingyi is a big success story. You own 10 apartments in Beijing, right?
0. I own 0. That's
I'm
why.
kidding. Yeah. These two are the big losers in Beijing because we don't own any of the apartments, but we're corrupted by the US culture. Everyone else in Beijing, they own apartments. That's personal success. Corporate profit is measured by how many apartments the corporate can afford in buying apartments in Beijing and Shanghai. People just put everything in housing on average. Urban area in China, 95% of households own their own apartments. 95%. But then in the national statistics, only 3% of GDP. The reason is, as Yingyi said, the way we calculate housing consumption in imputed rents is treat this as a fixed asset investments. So historical price, 50 years of depreciation, 2% of depreciation rate each year. And that's how you come up with the 3%. Now this is one item, right? 14%, 3%, I think it's in China, if you use international standard, this is underestimated by 5 or 8 or 10%. And I can go on for many other items, surveys, whatever. So consumption is seriously underestimated. Investment is seriously over-investment, estimated. If you add the GDP of all provinces and compare to the national GDP published by National Statistics Bureau, it's 6 trillion Chinese yuan. This is like 10% of GDP. Where does it come from? This is from double counting and exaggeration. And where does that get into? This goes into investment, right? The food, the clothes I bought in Beijing cannot be double counted. But investment can be double counted. Investment can be made up, right? So the investment in China's the national statistics is seriously overestimated. So if you balance the two, the rebalancing theory is actually, I think, a loose ground. And so what's going to happen is, I think, 2 things. One is that in the next few years, those people looking at China and feel that the economy was very rebalanced, they will be extremely happy. Because the National Statistics Bureau already knows this problem, and they will gradually rebalance it. And this is a statistical rebalancing, had nothing to do with the economy. So each year, the housing consumption will go up by 1%, and the service sector will go up by 1.5%. So you'll see the rebalance is going to be great. And this is what you're going to find in the next 5 years. So, and that's my view about the rebalance. And this is a totally wrong diagnosis, in my view. Because people are not really looking at the real number. They just look at the ratio, compare this with the US, and this is a typical story of really comparing apple and orange. And then that leads to the so almost universal wrong sort of diagnosis. That's just my personal view. Sorry,
I just want to add or amend a little bit. I think the data statistic is one issue, in particular the imputed rents. Given that housing ownership is extremely high in China, which is actually common for all the former centrally planned economy. That's just not because they own all the apartments, etc. So given the high ownership, housing owner, apartment ownership, plus that they use this depreciation method to calculate the consumption. I think that it is an issue. By the way, the data is a big problem. So last semester, I invited the deputy director of China National Statistics Bureau to come to my school to offer a course, the Chinese government statistics, which is very, very interesting because we know a little bit about statistics, but we don't know such detail. So we offer this course for our PhD students. We cannot offer many courses Stanford can offer, but this is one course I think is very unique and very useful because this is really very technical. This is all these details, how these numbers, including the GDP number, because this person, before he became the deputy director of the entire bureau, he was responsible for calculating all the GDPs. So he knows all the detail. But actually, after I sat in several classes, I felt that actually, first, they know what they're doing. All the problems we mentioned, they all know. They are all aware of that. And also, they actually have very close collaborations with the experts in the US, etc. So by the way, that's a side point. The point I go back to, suppose we take this statistics as given, using the same method as we have now. Last year, 2015, was the first time that consumption as the percentage of GDP for the first time in recent years was above 50%. That was the first time. The last 20 years always below 50%. The last year was the first time. Now, basically, the GDP decomposition, the 9% was agriculture. So only 9% agriculture. And then 50%, I think 50.4% is consumption.
So let me ask, we don't have a ton of time for questions. How about trying to do one or two? We've got a question over here.
So
Great,
this is
thanks.
going to be a little bit of a tough one. I lived in China for a while, and my wife is also Chinese, so I know quite a bit. I used to be an executive for Fortune 500 companies, and my question is really about fair trade. I remember when I was with one particular one, the largest network manufacturer in the world. We were manufacturing our equipment in Shenzhen. We had to import it to Hong Kong, then export it to China, adding roughly 30% tariff on our goods. Effectively, we were priced out. Whatever we made, it was already priced out. It didn't matter what we made. So we got a very small share of the market. If you actually look at the numbers, Americans import 4 times more than we actually export to China. 3 or 4 times or 5 times, I don't know. The numbers are staggering. And that's not because the Chinese don't want American goods or American goods are not good enough for them. It's exactly what the gentleman told you, is Chinese government blocks Americans selling stuff properly. Even if you actually look at Apple that sells iPhone there, I don't know if people know that Apple actually had to partner with someone local. 51% belongs to someone there. Where we allow Chinese companies to come in, own 100% of their business, do whatever they want to import. We actually allow them to have exactly the same tariff as everyone else, but the Chinese are very unfairly treating imports. It's not, the reason there's Baidu there is not because Google is not good enough. It's because Chinese government.
Let me try to, so do either of you want to comment on that?
You.
So let me try to understand the question first. So you're saying that why China export too much and import too little? Is that the question?
From the U.S. to China by putting all kinds of regulations on it. Why is Facebook not there?
China's unfair trade practice. I'm not an expert on this, but as just Yingyi mentioned, Uber spent $1 billion subsidy in China. That can be easily counted as unfair business practice dumping in China. So I guess overall, whether which way goes, unfair trade practice, which way it goes, really, I don't really know the true sort of overall statistics. But let me just mention something, maybe did not directly answer your question. It was considered China export too much to the rest of the world, and that's considered a problem. So that's related to the rebalancing thing, right? Since the Chinese growth relies too much on external demand and less internal demand. Now I think that the tone seems to be changing. So recently, Chinese published April's statistics. Chinese exporting dropped, maybe 5%, maybe 10%. And you see all the nerve in the world market. Chinese economy is going to collapse, and then so all the stock prices in the US and other places are affected. So people nowadays, I think, have a sort of different, slightly maybe different attitude towards the trade issue. If Chinese trade, both in terms of exporting and importing, really had a problem, this is not only a problem for China and then for the rest of the world, but it's also for China and the rest of the world. So that's the best I can do.
I just want to add one comment. Is I think Apple and Facebook are two very different cases, and I don't think that Apple that they sell very very well in China. For a few quarters, actually even oversold. They sold more in the Chinese market than in the U.S. And I don't think they need to form a partnership in order to sell. But Facebook is a different thing because that relates to the content, internet server, etc. So that's a very different thing. So Apple is doing extremely well in China, but Facebook cannot get into China. So these are the two different issues there. So
I think they did an official survey. 99% of Chinese people don't like Facebook.
well, you don't see it. How do you know that, right? You cannot accept that. So, you don't know.
Sorry, we've run over by a few minutes, and we pride ourselves at CEPR on being on time or almost on time. So please join me in thanking our two very distinguished speakers.